Hello, fellow splitting geniuses. Welcome to another live episode of Splitting Smart. I am Lila Aiken Ali, a divorce coach and the co-founder of Split.fyi. My partner, Heather Steer, and I welcome candid and informative discussions with divorce and well-being professionals. Our goal is to educate you around anything divorce and support you so that you unhitch with fewer hitches. Our topic for today will be covering special needs cases in divorce. And our guest is Tessa Elrod, who is a CFP and a CDA and the co-owner of the Next Step Financial Transitions and Next Step Divorce Solutions. Tessa has been working in the financial services industry over 13 years and specializes in working with women in divorce, young families, and families with children that have special needs, as she has personal experience with.
Hi, everybody.
Thank you for joining us. So Tessa and I met now over 4 years ago, I think, in a CDFA training program. Yeah, a long time ago. It's been fantastic. So I wanted to bring this conversation to our community today. Particularly, it's a really important topic for families with people in their nuclear family that have special needs. This can be children or adults or anyone, but I really appreciate your passion for this space. And it definitely has impacted, my community of friends and family. And, and the really sad thing that I was reading recently, and you and I were talking about this, Tessa, is that the divorce statistic for parents with special needs children is upwards of 75%. And I think you and I had even talked about it being potentially higher than that. And it's, divorce is already complicated enough. And then you throw in, the entity of someone who they have a person that will never be independent of needing the parental support or family support. So, it's clearly an area that needs focus and needs professionals like yourself that really specialize in this. So I would love for you to tell your why. I know it. And I think it's important for you to share what your passion is, because it's, it comes from the heart.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I've been in financial services for a long time, and kind of my journey that started in the divorce world was I just felt the calling for it. I had worked with a lot of individuals that were trying, especially women, that were trying to navigate finances and making finite decisions over stuff that they really had not even looked at or touched or understood. And that really expanded into the special needs. That's always been a passion of mine. My youngest brother, I'm one of 6, and the baby in the family started having seizures when he was an infant, and those seizures have caused him to the brain damage that have now led him to be fully dependent on, most of the time, my parents to care for him. And so watching them navigate all the things that you have to think about when you have a child that has a special need, and every family is completely different because there is no one size fits all. I mean, they're all, a lot of times a specific special need is they're put into categories based on what it is, whether that's something behavioral or it's something intellectual development disability. When did it start? There are all these different categories for things, and each of those have a different trajectory on those sources that are available. So watching how they've had to manage that, understanding how as a sibling it impacts us, and then seeing all the things that I have seen going on in the divorce arena, and understanding just how that can really make the divorce process so much more complex, but also that the co-parenting side of that has to be so much done more delicately. And unfortunately, that's not always the case. So there's times where you can look at this and you can do good co-parenting plans for the life of the child, and everybody's on the same page. Or it's having to navigate this with one spouse, and how are you going to handle it, and how do you think your ex-spouse is going to handle it, and how do we navigate that? So it does bring a whole new level of complexity to the divorce arena, and I just have a passion for helping all families with special needs, whether they're going through divorce or not, because I've seen the firsthand experience of what that does to a family. the stress that brings onto a family. We're very fortunate. My parents are still happily married. And I have lots of siblings that can step in and help, but not all families are as fortunate to be able to have siblings to do that.
Mhm.
Yeah, and have family that's local.
Right.
Yes.
And it's so hard because it is so important to be able to have that the caretakers hopefully be a family member and be a parent. And then you talk about divorce and it's like, well, wait a minute. So one person probably is going to be able to continue a career type path, but one person really isn't going to be able to go back to the workforce without having to hire a full-time caretaker. And I think that makes it difficult and makes you have to really think more creatively on the settlement side of things. Because there is going to be someone that isn't necessarily given the opportunity to go rebuild, or particularly because probably at that point someone has been staying home, right? And so that's, I think you and I have talked a lot about creative solutions around settlements because of that. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the benefits, when you're going and looking at the benefits in the different social services arenas. Many times they're income oriented, right? So let me explain that a little.
Yeah. So, well, you have a lot of different benefits that are both federal mandated. So then you have ones that are state specific. And you have a mixture of, needs-based versus not needs-based. A lot of times what families like my own fell within is, if you don't fall within that needs-based, and needs-based is really hard to actually get. I mean, you have to have less than 2,000 in assets. With a child with special needs, they, until they're 18, they look at the parents' assets as well. And then they can only earn so much income per month. So if they are working and don't have assets, they also can only work so much without causing any issues as well. So it's not just being able to qualify for those now as a child, but also how does that look over 18? So you have things like Social Security, SSI, and SSDI, and they are different. And who qualifies for what is slightly different. Then you have Medicaid versus, when does Medicare kick in? Medicaid is also, in some states, if you qualify for SSI, Medicaid is automatic. In some states, it's not. Sometimes it's an extra step. What a lot of people aren't aware of, which is shocking to me. My parents didn't find out about these until my brother was probably, he may have been closer to 7 years old because nobody ever told him. But there's things called Medicaid waiver programs. And so you have to get on a list. Once you get a diagnosis, you get on a list and you kind of just get on all of them. Sometimes every state has their own waiver programs. Some have a lot, some have few, some are targeted for certain types of things. The problem with these waiver programs is they can have a 10 to 14 year waiting list. So you really, finding out about them early on, if you have a child that was born with a disability, trying to get on those lists at that time so that they can then come on those. Those a lot of times are not necessarily needs based, but they're intertwined with some of those needs-based things. Then you may come up on multiple lists. Which ones do you go for? Well, that kind of goes back to the needs of the family and the needs of the child, because they all offer different things. And so yeah, so that's all done at the state level, the waiver programs, but then you also have the Social Security that's more on the federal side, and how a parent, so like with SSI, and this is kind of very high level, assuming you have a child that has an early diagnosis. When they become an adult and now the child's parents start to hit retirement age, there's potential that they could get onto SSDI under the parent as a disabled child. And there's extra benefits to that open up Medicare and all of that kind of thing. So there's a lot of resources out there. A lot of them are very state specific. And then that's not even touching on what therapy options are available. What about day programs? What about group homes? Are they going to stay in a home? Or are they going to go to a group home? And are they self-pay? Is it a private pay, or is it paid through some of these waiver programs or through Medicaid?
Where does one actually find out? Like, where do they begin to start finding this information and collating this information? Because as you said, I mean, it's government, it's state specific. So is
Yeah.
there
So one of my biggest frustrations and why I wanted to get into the special needs arena, and even as a professional, it's really hard to break into it because there's not even resources to teach professionals how to teach the parents. Some of my biggest people I learn from are the parents because they've done all the research themselves because there is not a one-stop shop. Now, most places have like their health and human services like website. A lot of times the waivers are embedded in there somewhere. Sometimes it's just, your good old Google searches. I also find that a lot of parents, if they have a specific diagnosis, like autism being one of them, being a big one, there's lots of Facebook groups or other social media groups or meetups or whatever that they join and they teach each other. Okay, I've done this and you've done that. So there really isn't a hub, which is why I have such a passion for wanting to get in this and be a resource for my community and for communities around the US, because there's very little consolidated place for people to go and learn all of these things. It's very piecemealed.
Right.
Wow.
Which makes it even more overwhelming when you're already facing, especially when you're facing a divorce, which is already overwhelming in itself. To find,
and you're dividing your assets in half typically around, and then trying to figure out how to live on that with a person that's typically more expensive than the, average child or dependent out there.
Yeah. And the other thing I run into on some of my cases is what the legal system will even allow you to do. If you're in a litigated situation, if you're mediating on your own, that's one thing. But when you're working with attorneys and you're going through that process, Texas is a great example. I'm in the Houston area. Texas is not a friendly spousal support area, and we have a very specific formula for child support. So going outside of that box begins to become complex and hard to pass because it doesn't fit in the norm. So having somebody that understands, okay, yes, I understand this is how we fit in the box, but this is really what their needs are. Right. And understanding that and working with those families and understanding the complexities that they're going to have to deal with. Is one of the big things, is understanding how your state's going to handle it too.
It is interesting because California is pretty progressive. We do have adult child support for special needs persons. So
yes, and we do here in Texas as well. But you kind of have to like if the child is under 18, and again, I'm not an attorney, don't put that out there. But you kind of want to establish that if there is not like a clear diagnosis, that both parents agree there's a diagnosis and that it's been proven, so that adult child support can come into the play when it needs to come into play, and that it's properly directed to the right types of resources, like a special needs trust or an ABLE account or something like that. Normally they go to the special needs trust.
Yep. That's a whole nother thing, is that people have to factor in the special needs trust, let alone their own personal trusts as well.
Yes.
It's harder. I want to shift gears a little bit because I think another interesting piece we touched upon it, is the parenting plan around special needs, and particularly custodial transfers, because, a lot of the families that I know, any sort of change in their lives is like almost impossible. And then you're talking about shared custody and going back and forth to different houses, and whether that person can not work during that custodial time or, be present or have the caretaker. And, I'd love to hear some of your stories around creative solutions and the hurdles that you've had to go through with some of your families that you've worked with.
Yeah, so kind of going back to the whole legal process, there's, you have your standard possession orders, and we have an expanded possession order here in Texas. And so it's a lot of times that's where things start. And then if you're going to do anything modified from that, you really need to have that conversation. Kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, that co-parenting is going to be super important, and both being on the same page. Because if you can't agree in a negotiation and a mediation how you want to do that division, a lot of times it falls right back to a standard possession order or expanded possession order. So working with both parents understanding what that child needs. What can they handle? How are they going to handle this transition? Is it going to be something that we need to morph over time? And then do we need to build that in? I know that in probably the most recent one that I did, that there was challenges with the transition for the parent that was moving out of the primary home, because anytime that child went outside the primary home, even though they were still with their parent that they were close with and they had a good relationship with, it was a whole different environment. And so they started acting out, and they started it, you're already emotionally getting past a divorce, but then now you have a child that's acting out that you really can't discipline. They're not acting out because they're being bad. They're acting out because they don't know how to cope, because that's just not something they can handle. So it's trying to understand, how do I meet my child's need to prepare them for this transition? And then, because there's going to be that likely no matter what with any kid, they're going to have a hard time transitioning. But it's working with, I haven't seen it done. I still hold out hope that some family out there may fall into this, but when you're dealing with a child that has a special needs, it may be that you're doing more of the house staying the same and the parents that are actually doing the transitioning. It doesn't work for every family. You really have to be a good co-parenters and have a good amicable, I think, divorce for that to happen, to be able to cohabitate in some way, shape, or form. But that's one avenue, that the child's not having to make the change as much from an environment standpoint. Some advice I had given was, when the parent that moved out of the primary home, let that child, if they're old enough, be involved in decorating their new room. I think, Heather, we had even talked about, making it look identical so that it doesn't seem like a change. So trying to think to the details of what that child is going to be experiencing, and listening to them, listening to what their fear is or what their frustration is. Is it just the change, or is it something specific that they're not comfortable with that you can actually take action to do? And then working together as a parent to do whatever different type of agreement, whether that's sharing a house, whether that's, doing longer stints with the child in one place, and then doing, they split and go longer stints with the other parent somewhere else. Maybe that's less of a back and forth than, that can always be a scenario. You really have to understand your child. And that's hard, because sometimes developmentally they're going to change, and that may look different as they get older.
Yeah.
Even in the best of circumstances, they change.
Even in the best of circumstances.
100%. And it's daunting on any child to go through that, the back and forth. It's unsettling. They don't have their same things. And in fact, that leads me to, do the government assistance programs actually equate for that? When they do take an effect, if two people have to live separately and have two different homes, but they need particular help and care in both homes equally, is there a particular care that helps, assistant program that helps with that makes sure that the
Not that I'm aware of, but now you're not looked as a unit. So like, if they're looking at the family, if the primary parent is also the one that's the primary caregiver, and their asset, they don't have, like, let's say it's a family that didn't have any assets to really split. You're really splitting children at the child custody at this point. Maybe they, as a family, as a single person, qualify for some of those needs-based, whereas they didn't as a married couple.
Interesting.
So again, the minimums are so low, it's really not easy. But those, the state programs, really, I would focus more on the state side for that kind of stuff.
Right.
And then there's a lot more, sadly, there's a lot more help, I feel like, on the adult side from my, research and looking at multiple states. There's a lot of resources more as the child becomes an adult, and vocational support, and they're no longer looking at the parent's income and the parent's assets to qualify for some of those needs assistance to make it a little easier as well.
That's really important to understand. I have a client that she gets paid as a caretaker for her child. So it actually allows her to generate some income as she was transitioning from married to single. So that was really helpful and something she had just discovered as well. So
yes. And those, if that's connected to a waiver program, like that they have respite hours. Some waivers allow that and some waivers do not. You really have to understand the ins and outs of those waivers. And it's not uncommon. I'm on a group with Texas waivers, and it's not uncommon that you may come up on the list for both of them. So you really want to look at the pros and cons and the long-term needs of that child to see which waiver is going to be the most appropriate for the whole family unit. And I think the hardest thing in whether it be divorce or planning for a special needs child, or they're all together, it's seeing past today.
Yeah.
It's doing that planning that goes not just to the end of the divorce, not just to the child's an adult, but it really is you're planning for 2 lifetimes. And it's trying to look forward to what may happen and what you hope to happen, or who you hope to step in, and who can step in and when, and all those things. It's all these questions that most people just don't ask themselves until they're there, because they can't think beyond today.
Very difficult too.
Well, I think that's what is so powerful about your combination of being, a CFP and a certified divorce financial analyst, and going in and trying to figure out whatever education and credentialing that you can get in this space is amazing. So I think, this has been an awesome amount of information. You can find Tessa in our portal at split.fyi.com. And she is based in Texas, but she does work with people around the country. So do you know that she is not state specific for particularly this topic? Mm-hmm. And this has been amazing. I really have a passion for also just wanting to get people in this situation to the best resources that they can. And I think you're definitely one of those top tier people. So thank you for your time today.
Yeah.
So thanks for having me.
Tessa, that was very insightful.
Awesome.